Each day in Franklin Yard, cars arrive and are sorted, most destined for outbound trains. One such outbound train is the daily local serving the towns of Lincoln and Chateaugay, called NVR 525 outbound and NVR 526 returning. To the customers and crews, this local is known only as the Chateaugay turn. Today we will follow the turn from its makeup in the yard, follow it out on the road to serving customers in Lincoln and Chateaugay, and finally its return back to the yard as train 526. Many yard crews have been at work collecting and sorting cars for this train before its departure each day. When the local returns after its run, additional crews will take over to handle the returning cars and to service the road power and caboose. The scene opens with the yard engine 103 leaving the engine terminal tracks, where it was parked for lunch. It is early afternoon as the yard crew will assemble train 525 on the departure track of Franklin Yard for a 2:45 p.m. departure. The first task is to pull the assigned caboose for the local from the caboose servicing track and spot it on the departure track. The cars making up this train have previously been sorted and are waiting at the head end of Yard Track 2. Today there are 4 cars to be delivered to customers by the local. Switch engine 103 pulls the cars for the local from Yard Track 2 and couples them onto the caboose waiting on the departure track. NVR 103 is one of the original diesel-electric locomotives purchased by the NVR in 1941 from EMD at its LaGrange plant. It is one of 6 NW2 Phase 1 models purchased by the railroad to test the new diesel technology of the time. These were 1,000 horsepower units designed for yard work, and they performed so well that the NVR went on to purchase additional diesel road power. After coupling, the entire consist is shoved down the track to clear the yard switches and to spot the head car near an air connection hose adjacent to the track. At this point, the work of assembling train 525 is complete and the switcher and crew goes on to another job in the yard. Train 525 needs to have its air hoses connected and checked for air leaks. The journal bearings of the cars and caboose have already been checked and filled when they first arrived in the yard, usually within the past 24 hours. The departure track is closed with markers, and the car knockers take over these duties of performing the final inspection and test before allowing the train to depart to the main line. The checks at this time are minimal, since all of the cars have been pre-checked when they were assembled on Yard Track 2. However, this final inspection adds the caboose to the consist. Today's consist is a relatively short train of 4 loaded cars to be delivered along the way. In addition, empty cars and a loaded car will be picked up by the local at Lincoln and Chateaugay during its stops at those towns. As departure time approaches, road switcher NVR 1002 has been fueled and inspected by the engine house crew, with the engine hostler moving it around the terminal. We find it waiting at the sanding tracks of the engine terminal ready for the local head-end crew to board. The local's crew of 2 brakemen, 1 conductor, and 1 engineer is gathered at the crew room in the Franklin Yard office ahead of time to go over the trip and to pick up their train orders. The conductor and rear brakeman stop by the yard clerk to pick up the waybills and any switching instructions for the trip. The head-end brakeman and engineer make their way to the engine terminal to board their locomotive. When all of the car knockers inspecting the departing train have completed their job and removed all of the flags, signs, and marker lights that had closed the departure track, the yardmaster is notified. The conductor and rear brakeman have already walked the train and checked that there is a proper waybill for each car. They are waiting on board the caboose for the trip to begin. The head-end crew moves locomotive NVR 1002 from the engine terminal after authorization is granted by the yardmaster, and with the brakeman throwing switches, it makes its way through the yard to the head end of train 525. NVR 1002 was purchased as part of the third lot of diesels for the NVR in 1947. At that time, the NVR purchased 6 RS1 units from American Locomotive, more commonly known as ALCO, since EMD had a large backlog of orders for other railroads at the time. NVR 1002 has been a solid trouble-free performer for the half-dozen years that it has been operating, primarily assigned to local train jobs. The crew likes it, and the engine shop hasn't had trouble maintaining it, other than the ongoing job of keeping it topped off with lubricating oil. After the engineer completes the air test of the train brakes and the signal is given by the yardmaster and dispatcher, Local 525 is ready to depart Franklin as it pulls ahead through the Y onto the main line west and into the first tunnel. We next catch up to the Chateauguay turn as it arrives in Lincoln. Lincoln is the home of the Romanowski Coal Company, a local coal distributor. It is a steady customer of the railroad, with many hopper cars of coal delivered throughout the year. As the train eases to a stop, the conductor notes that an empty hopper is waiting to be picked up. Another hopper is being unloaded on the coal siding, and a full hopper of coal is on the head end of this train for delivery to the coal company. The local has clearance to block the main line to switch the coal siding, and so the engine uncouples from the train and the engineer and brakeman proceed to pull forward to access the siding to pick up the empty coal car that is waiting. Fortunately, this car is the lead car on the siding and can be pulled out without moving other cars. Next, the local has to clear the main line to meet the milk train, NVR 16, that is heading east. The local will stay off the main line in Lincoln, while train 16, coming from stops in Adams and Chateaugay, arrives and performs its milk stop at Lincoln. The local is stuck in the hole until train 16 departs Lincoln because it must use the main line to complete its switching moves. Today, the milk train is steaming into town behind NVR 426, a consolidation that is typically assigned to that job. The milk train carries a passenger combine on the rear end, and that car is dropped at the Lincoln station for passengers to board and exit the train, while the milk platform switching operations are being conducted a few hundred yards up the line. All the while, we can see our Chateaugay turn, local 525, parked on a siding in town in the background. After the milk train completes its work at the Lincoln milk platform, it backs onto the waiting combine and continues its trip east out of town. Train 525 comes back to life once the main line is open. It must service a siding to the freight house on a leading point switch on the siding. To do this, the locomotive must run around its train and work the train from behind. Since the two cars on the head end of the train are not part of this move, the conductor has the engine separate them from the back half of the train before the runaround on the main line. The freight house is expecting a loaded car to be delivered today and a partially loaded car to be picked up. There is also another car that is in the process of being unloaded at the freight house, but it is not ready to be picked up by today's local. Complicating all of this is a second loading dock on the siding with a boxcar, blocking access into the freight house. This boxcar must be temporarily moved out of the way to switch the freight house and then return to its spot at the loading dock. We will follow the switching moves worked out by the conductor to accomplish the task of picking up the partial load at the freight house and spotting the loaded car in its place. Once there, the engine shoves the remaining local cars and caboose onto the freight house siding to pick up the freight house car and the loading dock car that is blocking the way. Once the two cars are removed from the siding and placed on the adjacent track, the new freight house car is shoved in and spotted at the freight house dock. The engine pulls out of the siding with the car for Chateauguay still attached and moves the loading dock car back from its temporary location on the adjacent track to the dock where it was. This completes the switching moves for the freight house. The locomotive is now ready to assemble the string of cars remaining on the local, run around the train, and couple on to the head end. Once the train is cleared to use the main line, it resumes its trip, passing first through St. Jean Junction. Once arriving at Chattagate, it must wait for a passing passenger train, Train 2, the Green Mountain. The freight local stays on the main line away from the station platform and waits for Train 2. Today, the NVR has run substituted passenger equipment on the Green Mountain, which is normally a passenger train. In a short while, the approaching rail diesel car, or RDC, can be seen as it pulls into the station alongside the waiting local freight. The NVR only has a single RDC at this time, NVR 20. It was purchased in August of 1950 from the Bud Company as a means of reducing the costs associated with declining ridership on trains 9 and 10 on the Bedford branch. Although passenger ridership on the NVR main line between Adams, Franklin, and Hamilton is still satisfactory, management is running trials to determine the advisability of expanding the use of RDC equipment all around the railroad. After the RDC station stop, the local is now cleared to use all tracks in Chattagate for switching duties. There are 2 cars on the local train to be dropped off at consignees in Chattagate. The first is a main central green boxcar at the rear of the train with a load of feed for Oliver Feed and Seed Company. Before that can happen, there is an empty CPR boxcar at Oliver's siding that needs to be picked up. This is accomplished by temporarily using the neighboring Mobil Oil Company siding to swap the cars during the switching move. After switching Oliver feed and seed, a remaining loaded boxcar destined for Abe's Hardware remains near the front of the train to be spotted. The Abe's Hardware siding is accessed through a leading point switch, so the engine must run around the train to push cars into this siding from the caboose end. In running around the train, the locomotive will bring the empty coal hopper from the front of the train with it so that the car for Abe's Hardware will now be the lead car of the string. The length of the local is short enough so that the load for Abe's can be spotted on the dock using the entire string of cars attached. At this point, all of the switching assignments for the Chateauguay turn have been completed for the day. Using both the station track and the main line at Chateauguay, the engine is able to build train 526 for the return trip to Franklin with the caboose and remaining cars. Today, there will be no meets on the way home to Franklin. The yard receiving track is clear, and the local is cleared to pull in without stopping, which brings a smile to the faces of the crew of the local. Because this is summer, there are still a few hours of daylight remaining, but many other times of the year, this local returns in the dead of darkness. After parking on the arrival track, the RS-1 road engine is uncoupled from the train, and the head-end crew turns it over to the Franklin Yard hostler before heading to the yard office. Likewise, the rear-end crew leaves the caboose and takes their paperwork to the yard office to file the required reports for the day's activities. Then, it's time to sign time cards and head home. If there is no expected traffic into or out of the yard in the immediate future, the car knocker will come out to the parked train and fill the wheel journal bearings and bleed the brakes on the cars. Any bad order cars will be tagged at this time, and the yard clerk and yardmaster will be notified. If the arrival track is not available for this work, the yard switcher will move the cars to a yard temporary holding track for this work to be completed. Today, because there is insufficient time to let the cars remain on the arrival track for maintenance and inspection, the yard switcher is instructed to move the entire string of 3 cars in the train to yard track 2 for this work. The yard crew will first spot the caboose on the caboose servicing track. Because the arriving local is so short, the yard crew is able to bleed the air from each of the cars as they walk past without delay before the yard switcher ties onto the string to move it, thus saving time. As a rule, all of the cars on the classification tracks of the yard have their brake reservoirs bled off, and they are free to roll around. This is acceptable because the yard is built on flat ground and nothing should move without a push from the locomotive. But it is important to remember that once a car is rolling, it won't stop very soon unless it hits another car. A slowly rolling car makes no noise, so yard workers have to be constantly looking in all directions when working in the yard. While the local Chattagate turn was out on the road today doing its work, other freight and interchange trains came into Franklin Yard. These trains have cars with freight for consignees at Lincoln or Chattagate. As the yard crews switch those drop-offs at Franklin, the cars in them for Lincoln and Chattagate will be moved to a designated yard track to hold for tomorrow's Chattagate turn. At the same time, the cars that came into Franklin Yard on today's Chattagate turn will have waybills made up for them by the freight agent, and they will be switched to other tracks to be picked up by trains visiting Franklin over the next 24 hours. Occasionally, a car will arrive in the yard with a defect that requires immediate attention. In cases where the car cannot be repaired out in the yard, that car will be tagged and moved to a repair-in-place track, also known as the RIP track. As soon as repairs are made to make the car safe for the main line, the car is moved back in the switching cycle with the other cars to send it to its next stop. Railroading on the NVR is a 24-hour operation. There are many railroad employees working to keep the freight and passengers moving as advertised. This movie only covers a small portion of railroad operations, only touching on the operation of local trains that serve the railroad's customers at their sidings or team tracks.